Hello, and welcome to this talk on tragedy, where we'll be looking at process, creation, exploitation, and authenticity in regards to tragedy and tragedy works. My name's Art Banimandib, and I'm a second year PhD student at Royal Holloway, University of London, reading music composition. Before beginning, I'd just like to give a disclaimer that sensitive themes will be discussed in this presentation and audience discretion is advised. So for me, it's important to set a groundwork by looking at a definition, and the definition of tragedy that I work with is that of an event, series of events, or situation causing great suffering, destruction, or distress, and typically involving death, especially on a large scale or prematurely. So I'd like to invite you at this point to just have a moment of reflection and ask yourself, where were you on September 11th, 2001? On July 7th, 2005, and on the 26th of March 2020. Pause the video, and once you've had a moment to reflect, we'll come back. Before continuing, I just want to give a background to my PhD project titled Isolated Sound. Isolated Sound looks at interpretive frameworks for live installation, looking at the COVID-19 pandemic in the UK. In order to do this, it explores works associated to the Holocaust, 9/11, and other global tragedies, looking at the depictions of tragedy through music and live installation. It uses practice-led research as its primary method, and challenges the notions of ownership of both tragedy and the creative process, with a focus on audience and composer well-being. So, where were you on September 11th, 2001? On the 7th of July 2005, the day of the London bombings, and on March the 26th, 2020, when the UK entered the first lockdown. Now each of us will either have a direct experience of being alive on that day, or will have learnt about it subsequently. However, I can guarantee that everybody listening or watching this video has a connection or a perspective to these events based off their own exposure and experience within these events. And that's important because it's that difference between each individual based off one tragedy that is of particular interest to me. And a great activity I found that I find helps me to break down my own trauma or thoughts on a tragedy is the 3-minute recount. As the name implies, all you need to do is sit down, set the timer for 3 minutes and pick a theme, and write as many words or thoughts that come to your mind in that time. From left to right, you can see 3 examples here. The first being the 9/11 attacks, the 7/7 bombings, and the pandemic. Now, having talked about all of these individual experiences that we all have, these individual experiences can come together to form a collective experience where one tragedy with many perspectives makes a community of different experiences. Within that, it's important to see that there are different types of trauma associated to that tragedy, based off where we were and how we engaged within that tragedy. So primary, were you there? Do you know somebody who was lost? Were you directly impacted by it? And primary trauma or exposure causes direct trauma. Secondary experience within a tragedy, were you watching it on TV? Have you been watching a movie on it? Have you read a book on it? Are you researching it currently, or did you go to a museum? That can cause vicarious trauma, and in the digital age, this is becoming increasingly more prevalent. And mimetic trauma, knowledge passed down to individuals, groups, or generations, be it from family, curriculum, government, music, and media. This has been metamorphosized or given a metamorphic representation through the radioactive transfer model by Campbell, which shows how all of these individual experiences come together and bounce off each other, creating new knowledge, positive or negative, into a wider community. So now let's look at processing tragedy as a depiction. Now, this well-known Adorno quote, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric," has been used a lot, but it's important to understand what Adorno was saying here. Now, this is of course down to interpretation, but what I take from this is the notion that if you were to literally write poetry after Auschwitz, if you release that or that becomes something that is shared, you are releasing or sharing work based off the loss of life or the suffering of others. And in that way, you are exploiting the individuals that suffered as a result of that tragedy. However, writing poetry might be your outlet of processing, and it's important to be aware that we all have our own ways of processing tragedy and the trauma associated to it. Different methods of depicting tragedy and processing trauma include written form of journaling, poetry, and blogging, spoken, therapy, friends, family, community groups, media such as music composition, songwriting, screenwriting, physical engagement with the source, visiting the direct site, watching footage, and interdisciplinary methods combining one or more of the above. Key findings in my current research have found strong support for the use of music in trauma processing, with particular links to songwriting being the dominant form, though not in isolation. It has highlighted that if people are processing their own trauma at home or independently, individually, what well-being checks are in place to ensure that their safety is being acknowledged. And this goes for creators and receivers of trauma as well. Engaging with trauma directly or secondary also increases negative and harmful characteristics on individuals, with potential to form addiction to the trauma. And finally, I found research showing interdisciplinary works as being pivotal to aid in potential healing and community restoration in the aftermath of a tragedy. So with these findings, two questions that I would like to propose are: how does society influence the ways in which an individual attempts to engage with tragedy? And what are the moral and ethical dilemmas presented when engaging with tragedy from a personal perspective? And how can these be exploited? Now, the exploitation of tragedy can take many forms and is subjective to an extent, but it can be argued that, again, if we are to set a narrative at the expense of suffering of others, that we are exploiting that suffering for our own purposes. This is especially true when we politicize tragedies. It can also be argued that communities and groups can create collective representations of an event to portray a set narrative, and in itself that is also exploitation. Because when we look at a tragedy, we should look at the true events of it and not an altered narrative to affect how a group interacts. A setback that can occur with creating set narratives or set responses from groups is that when groups start to splinter off and disagree or find different interpretations of a tragedy, it can damage the social fabric, causing disruption, cancellation, and outcry. Now, this all comes together in what I call the conundrum of tragedy works, where three writers provide a very good dialogue to explore within. These are Adorno, Camus, and Barthes. Now, as I've mentioned, Adorno sees that when you release tragedy work, a capital product can be made, and that capital product exploits the lives lost for financial gain, or political exploitation, which could be taken to the extent of malicious intent. Camus looks at it slightly differently and says that as a creator, part of the act of creating is to know that you are the vulnerable entity here, and once the work is created, it goes into an unforgiving world, and therefore the only thing you can do is make the work true to yourself, giving you the authenticity behind your work. For Barthes, he says that the intent of the creator cannot be imposed on the audience, and thus even though the creator has a set intention for their work, once it is released, they have to relinquish control and let the audience interpret it in their own way. In all of these situations, there has to be an acknowledgement for the fact that once a work is released into the public, it can be repurposed, repackaged, and used for a plethora of reasons that you may not have intended. I'm going to go through two examples now that contrast each other based off their uses. The first is, courtesy of the Red, White and Blue, The Angry American, by American country artist Toby Keith. This was released in the year following the September 11th attacks and uses strong collective grouping in language choice such as American girls, American guys, and the word we to give a collective voice of a nation to the listeners. It uses the American flag and strong symbology and patriotic themes such as the Statue of Liberty, Bald Eagle, Mother Freedom, and Uncle Sam. And this comes together to give a collective voice of anger representing the American nation, the United States, on the attackers that committed the tragic events of September 11th. However, this doesn't speak for everyone, especially in 2002 when the calls for war and military action were causing divisive debate across the West. In contrast to the emotive and group language used by Toby Keith, Gordon Lightfoot's The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a narrative account of the real-time maritime disaster of the Edmund Fitzgerald, uses a AAA form and a folk style to tell a researched and well-accounted story of the wreck of the misfortuned vessel. Lightfoot, in order to make this piece, did speak to family members and researched the news and other media in order to build an accurate account, to the extent that when new information was presented, contrary to the written lyric, Lightfoot amended the lyrics to maintain accuracy. Now, these are two different ways of putting work out into the world. Both were performed, both were sold. But in one, you can see the channeling of groupthink to set a narrative, and in the other, you can see a perception and a willingness to want to maintain accuracy for documentation purposes. And this gives considerations to how creators can depict tragedy in a way that aids in their own processing of an event about their audience. And it asks if creators need to be aware of the potential exploitation in the first place. It all comes down to striking a balance. And for me, I found this when creating a series of works depicting the 7/7 terror attacks in London. I use selfies as my primary visual alongside created works using found sound and recorded instrumentation. In this process, I put myself through quite a few moral and ethical choices, and my notes reflect on this as I'm processing how I personally want to depict this tragedy. Through the completion of the work, I created the prison model, where I think that the best way to give autonomy to the creator to process their own trauma in relation to a tragedy and create a product that goes out into the world, potentially, is to look through an ethical, moral, and societal lens in order to create using practice, reading or research, and the creative process in itself. By doing this, I believe that you create a situation where the individual has autonomy and processing ability with an awareness of the wider aesthetic. And this is because in my key findings are, we have to remember that tragedy is unique to the individual, but how these unique strands come together build a community and a collective narrative. When putting a work out, we have to remember that we are just one voice providing a resource that others can connect with positively or negatively. And that is subjective. And creators should be aware of the potential exploitation and work released into the public sphere. And from providing frameworks, such as the prison model, to engage with tragedy, you offer a blend of autonomy to the individual, but they can work within their own framework and help build authenticity on their part. I'd like to leave with a quote of, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And as we process our own tragedy, it's important to know that by doing that, we keep the memory of the tragedy alive so that others won't forget it in the aim of not repeating it. If you'd like to find out more about my research, you can go to www.artmakesmusic.com or scan the QR code here. And finally, years after the Poetry After Auschwitz statement, Adorno did write that perennial suffering has as much a right to expression as the tortured have to scream. This is a key way to end this presentation, as for me, it shows that we all have the right to process our own connections to tragedy. And as long as we all continue to process our tragedy and talk about our process and put our process into the world, we keep the knowledge pool of that tragedy alive and enhance the debate and discussion and community based around a tragedy in the hope of helping ease trauma for future generations. I'd like to invite you to consider the following questions. What draws us to explore tragedy? How do we engage in tragedy? What, if anything, should be done to ensure accuracy and reduce exploitation? Does the responsibility fall solely on the creator, researcher, or individual? And how does the community influence our perspective after a tragic event? Thank you.